Richard Carter had built his empire on order. Every hour of his life was accounted for, every second measured and weighed against value. His mornings never wavered a 5 o'clock workout, a cold shower set precisely to 3 minutes, a double espresso brewed by his in-house barista, and then the march into another day of endless decisions that bent markets and shifted entire industries. His staff often joked that if you wanted to know what Richard was doing 3 weeks from now, you only had to check the calendar. There it would be, slotted neatly between other immovable obligations. Emergencies were planned for, contingencies mapped out. Chaos was a thing for other people, never for him. That was why, when his personal phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number late in the afternoon, he nearly let it ring itself out. He did not answer calls that weren't logged, not on that private line. It was reserved for the board, his family lawyer, and perhaps to others. Yet something a pull, a flicker of instinct he didn't trust made his hand move. He pressed the green button, expecting silence or the clumsy pitch of a telemarketer. Instead, what came through was the sound of breathing. Quick, uneven, small. Then a voice, fragile and trembling. "Hello? Can someone help? Mommy. Mommy's not moving." The word struck him like a sudden jolt of electricity. He sat up straighter in his chair, the skyline of glass and steel outside his office windows suddenly fading into nothing. Before he could speak, another voice, just as young but a little stronger, overlapped the first. "We're sorry. We used the number in Mommy's phone. She said to call this one if something bad happened." For a man who prided himself on never being caught off guard, Richard felt his grip uncertainly slipping. His pen rolled from between his fingers onto the desk, forgotten. He asked their names, asked where they were. His voice calm in tone, but heavy with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Fear. On the other end, there was hesitation, a rustle, then a tiny answer with an address in a neighborhood far removed from his world of glass towers and penthouses. He scribbled it on the notepad meant for quarterly figures, his handwriting jagged where it was normally pristine. In that moment, everything he thought immovable shifted. He pressed the intercom to cancel the remainder of his afternoon schedule, his voice curt, leaving no explanation. Meetings worth millions dissolved with a single sentence. Within minutes, he was in the back seat of his black sedan, the city blurring past the tinted windows as his driver followed the address scrawled in black ink. The drive was no more than 30 minutes, but it felt longer, every tick of the clock punctuated by the echo of those voices. He replayed their words over and over. "Mommy's not moving. She said to call this one." Questions buzzed inside his head, sharp and insistent. Who were these children? Why would their mother have his number? And what kind of woman would tell her daughters that he, Richard Carter, a man who kept his distance from almost everyone, was the one to call in their darkest moment? As the car turned off the main avenues and into streets lined with broken fences, faded storefronts, and sagging apartment buildings, Richard felt an unease he couldn't name. This was a place he had never stepped into, a world far from the pristine halls of his company or the polished stone of his penthouse. Yet here he was, pulled forward by something that had nothing to do with logic or profit. For the first time in years, Richard Carter wasn't following a plan. He was following a voice. And with every passing block, the certainty grew in him that this was not just an accident. This was something else entirely, something that would not leave his life untouched. The sedan rolled to a stop in front of a building that looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. Richard stared through the tinted glass at the cracked stairwell, the broken banister leaning to one side, the spray-painted walls that spoke of neglect and survival. His polished shoes struck the pavement as he stepped out. The contrast, almost violent steel and silk meeting peeling concrete. He wasn't supposed to be here. Men like him never were. Yet the words from the phone call pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't set down. "Mommy's not moving." He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his hand brushing against the rusting rail that left streaks of orange on his skin. The numbers on the doors were crooked or missing, some carved in with knives, others written in marker. When he reached the right one, his hand hovered in the air, ready to knock, but before he could, the door cracked open. Two little girls stood in the gap, no more than 5 years old. They were identical, blonde hair falling in messy curls around pale faces, blue eyes wide and brimming with fear. They wore matching pink dresses, one with a darker stain splashed across the front. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the smaller one whispered, as if afraid the world would take the words away from her, "You came." Those 2 words hit harder than anything he'd heard in the boardroom or courtroom. They weren't relief, Not exactly. They were belief, the kind of faith that shouldn't belong to children so young. He didn't ask permission. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The smell hit him instantly, burnt food and something sharper, toxic gas. His instinct screamed at him. He moved past the girls, his long strides carrying him into a cramped kitchen where a young woman lay collapsed on a linoleum, her skin waxen, her breath shallow. On the stove, a pot boiled over, the blue flame hissing beneath it, leaking its poison into the air. Richard snapped into motion. He turned the burner off with a quick twist, yanked open the small window that barely clung to its hinges, and dropped to his knees beside her. Emily, he muttered, though he didn't know why he spoke the name somewhere deep in his memory. Recognition stirred. He shook her shoulder gently, but she didn't move. The girls stood in the doorway, clutching each other like lifelines. One of them whimpered, "Is she? Is Mommy?" Her voice broke before she could finish. Richard's chest tightened, a sensation both foreign and unbearable. He pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with the kind of clarity he normally reserved for billion-dollar crises. His voice was steady, precise, giving the operator every detail, address, condition. The smell of gas, children present. The operator told him to stay on the line, to keep her airway clear, to wait for the medics. As he followed the instructions, his eyes flicked around the room. No photos, no framed memories, no television or luxury, only bare essentials. A single table with one chair broken at the leg. A shelf stacked with cans of beans and cheap pasta. This wasn't just poverty. This was survival. "Girls," he called softly, not turning his head from Emily. "What's your mom's name?" The older twin swallowed, her little voice trembling. "Emily." Richard froze, his heart slamming once in his chest. The world seemed to tilt. "Emily Hayes?" His words came out quieter than he intended. The younger girl nodded. "She used to work for you," Mommy said once. For a moment, Richard felt the air leave his lungs. Emily Hayes. He remembered her not vividly, but enough. A bright, quiet infant 6 years ago, who had surprised him once with an idea so sharp it made the boardroom fall silent. A girl who had seemed to hold promise like it was stitched into her very being, and then gone. Vanished without notice, without explanation. One day there, the next erased from his world. Now here she was, pale and still on a kitchen floor in a forgotten apartment. Her daughter standing in pink dresses stained with the proof of struggle. The distant wail of sirens pierced the silence. Red and blue lights flared against the thin curtains moments later. Richard stayed kneeling until paramedics burst in, filling the apartment with practiced urgency. They swarmed Emily, their clipped voices naming vitals and commands. One medic turned to him and asked about relation. For the first time in years, Richard hesitated. "I knew her. A long time ago." His eyes flicked to the girls, who clung to each other, staring at him with something both desperate and trusting. As Emily was lifted onto a stretcher, one of the girls darted forward, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's limp hand. "It's okay, Mommy," she whispered. "He came. You said he would." Richard Carter, who had spent his life building towers of glass and power, felt something shift inside him that no fortune could measure. And as the medics carried Emily away, the girl's eyes never left him. In that silent exchange, a man who had never let anyone derail his carefully built order realized he could not walk away. Not now. Not ever. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights and clipped medical orders. But to Richard it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. He sat rigid on the narrow bench inside, one little girl pressed against each side of him, their tiny hands gripping his arms as if letting go would mean the world itself would collapse. Their trust was terrifying. He was used to boardrooms full of people who feared him, admired him, or wanted something from him. But these children weren't calculating. They were simply holding on because they believed he was the only anchor they had left. Emily lay on the stretcher opposite, oxygen mask covering her face, IVs already taped into her thin arms. Her chest rose and fell shallowly under the harsh fluorescent lights, every breath mechanical, fragile. Richard couldn't stop staring. Memories began to surface in fragments, like broken glass. Emily's shy smile during her internship, the way her eyes had lit up when she pitched that idea 6 years ago, the quiet determination she carried even when she was overlooked by louder voices. And then, nothing. Her sudden disappearance from his company had been a footnote in his busy empire, barely a ripple at the time. But now, seeing her like this, he felt the shame of not having noticed. of not having cared enough to ask why. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the hospital entrance. A flurry of doctors and nurses rushed forward, wheeling Emily through swinging double doors. Richard started to follow, but a nurse held up her hand firmly. "Only immediate family," she said. The words hung between them, sharp and damning. He froze, not sure what he was anymore. The girls didn't hesitate. They tugged his hands insistently, their small faces pale, but resolute. "He is family," one of them said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of conviction. The nurse blinked, uncertain, then relented. Richard followed. Hours passed in a haze of antiseptic carters, beeping machines, and endless waiting. The twins curled up on a hospital couch beside him, one resting her head on his shoulder, the other tracing the seam of his sleeve with her finger as if the texture itself offered comfort. Richard, a man who once thought silence was his weapon, found the quiet unbearable now. His mind kept circling the same questions. Why had Emily listed his number as the one to call in an emergency? Why had she vanished from his world without explanation? And the one he couldn't push away. No matter how he tried, why did these little girls look at him with eyes that mirrored his own? Finally, a doctor entered, clipboard in hand, expression professional, but gentle. "She's stable for now," he said. She suffered from exhaustion, untreated infection, and significant stress. Her body couldn't take it anymore. She slipped into a coma. "We don't know how long it may last." The words hit Richard like a gavel strike, final, heavy, undeniable. He thanked the doctor in a voice that sounded distant even to his own ears. When the doctor left, he turned to the girls. They sat stiffly, watching him with wide eyes. He forced his voice to soften. Do you know where your father is?" For a moment, neither spoke. Then the older twin lifted her chin and said with heartbreaking simplicity, "We don't have one. Mommy said we were a special team of 3. The sentence landed in Richard's chest like a blow. He looked at their faces again, the shape of their jaw, the spark in their eyes, the way they tilted their heads when they were uncertain. Recognition burned through him like fire. These weren't just any children. They were his. His breath caught, but before he could speak, the younger girl whispered something that froze him in place. "Mommy said you'd come one day, when it mattered most." Richard leaned back in the stiff hospital chair, his pulse thundering in his ears. The walls seemed to close in, sterile white pressing on all sides. For the first time in his life, Richard Carter, the man who had built skyscrapers, crushed competitors, and orchestrated empires, felt completely unprepared. His empire of order and control meant nothing here. These children didn't care about his billions or his influence. They cared only about whether he would stay or walk away, and in that moment, as the weight of their words pressed against him, Richard knew one thing with startling clarity: walking away was no longer an option. But outside those hospital walls, danger still lingered. Emily's collapse hadn't been just illness or poverty, it smelled of something darker. Someone had wanted her silenced, erased. And now Richard was beginning to realize that by stepping into this, by answering that call, he had not only uncovered a hidden part of his past, he had walked straight into a storm that could destroy everything he thought he knew. The hospital room was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of monitors that measured the fragile rhythm of Emily's body. Richard sat in the corner, elbows resting on his knees, his tie loosened for the first time in years. The twins had fallen asleep against him, their small heads heavy on his arms, their breathing uneven but steady. He had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and markets that threatened to collapse under his feet. Yet nothing compared to this, the silence of 2 children clinging to him, as though his presence alone could keep their world from falling apart. When the door creaked open, he glanced up sharply. A woman in a blazer stepped inside, her badge glinting under the fluorescent light. She introduced herself in clipped tones as a representative from Child Protective Services. She looked at the twins with practiced empathy and then at him with detached authority. "Sir, until the mother regains consciousness, these girls will need to be placed in foster care. It's protocol." Richard's jaw tightened. He had built his fortune on bending protocols, on rewriting rules that others swore were immovable. But this was a business, this was blood, though he hadn't yet said the words aloud. He lowered his voice, steady and lethal. "They're not going anywhere." The woman didn't flinch. She'd dealt with desperate families before. "Unless you can prove guardianship, you have no authority here. They'll be placed in care until the courts decide otherwise." Richard's hand brushed against the curls of the sleeping child against his shoulder, and something inside him snapped. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Within 20 minutes, his lead attorney, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, was at the hospital with a stack of papers already drafted. Temporary guardianship, expedited orders, emergency authorizations. His legal team moved with the precision of soldiers in war. Richard signed without hesitation, his signature bold and final across every page. The CPS worker raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. When the attorney handed her the paperwork, she read it once, then twice, and finally nodded stiffly. Very well. But understand, this is temporary. The word lingered, sour in the air. Richard didn't respond. His focus had already shifted back to Emily, lying motionless on the hospital bed. Temporary, he thought, but in his chest, he knew there was nothing temporary about what he was feeling. Later that night, he returned to his penthouse with the girls in tow. The elevator doors opened to reveal glass walls overlooking the city, floors polished like mirrors, and silence so deep it felt sterile. The twins stepped inside cautiously, their pink dresses dulled by the glow of crystal chandeliers. This was a palace compared to their apartment, but their eyes didn't widen in awe. Instead, they looked small, lost, clutching each other's hands. Is this where we live now? One of them asked, her voice tiny against the cavernous space. Richard crouched down to meet their eyes. For once, he didn't have an answer ready. For now, he said, though the words felt like a lie. For now implied uncertainty. But he already knew he would burn every skyscraper he owned. Before letting them slip through his fingers, he ordered his staff to bring everything the children could need: clothes, toys, books, warm food. Within hours, the sterile penthouse softened, scattered with plush animals and crayons, laughter creeping into the corners where silence once reigned. Richard watched as the girls began to draw on a sheet of paper spread across the marble floor. One drew a woman lying in a bed with tubes attached. The other drew a tall figure standing beside her, holding the hands of two little girls. The image made his chest ache. He turned away, hiding the storm in his face, but storms have a way of arriving without warning. That night, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the glittering skyline, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. 5 words appeared on the screen: "Stay out of this, Carter." His grip on the phone tightened until the glass creaked. His eyes flicked back to where the twins slept curled up on the couch, innocents wrapped in blankets, oblivious to the shadows already circling. Emily's collapse hadn't been chance. Someone had wanted her silenced. Someone had wanted those girls unprotected. And Richard Carter, who had once thought control meant calendars and contracts, now understood control meant something else entirely. Keeping these children alive. The man who built empires had just declared war. The city stretched out beneath Richard Carter's penthouse like a jeweled sea, endless lights flickering against the night. He stood before the glass, hands braced on the railing, but his gaze wasn't on the skyline. It was on the reflection in the glass, the 2 small figures curled up under blankets. On his leather couch, their soft breathing was the only sound in the vast apartment, and for the first time, Richard understood what silence could cost. The message still glowed on his phone. "Stay out of this, Carter." 5 words. No name, no traceable number, a threat disguised as advice. He read it again and again, feeling anger build beneath his ribs. For years, he had commanded boardrooms with words sharper than knives. Competitors feared him. Markets bent to his decisions. But this was different. Someone had wanted Emily erased, and now those same shadows were circling her children, his children. Though he hadn't yet dared to say it aloud, at dawn, when the twins were still asleep, he slipped into his study, the room where his empire was usually orchestrated. Today, it became a war room. He summoned his chief of security, a man who had once worked in intelligence. "I want everything on Emily Hayes," Richard ordered. "Where she's been the last 6 years, who she's been near, and why the hell she disappeared." Hours later, files began to flood in: bank records, medical visits, rental histories. Patterns emerged like cracks in glass. Emily had lived quietly, always one step ahead of something. She changed addresses frequently, took small jobs under aliases, never stayed long enough to build roots. It wasn't random. It was survival. She had been hiding, and then Richard saw it, one link tying her back to his world. 6 years ago, the year she vanished, Emily had been attached to a project inside his company. A product launch that had collapsed under suspicious circumstances. Billions lost, reputations destroyed. At the time, the blame had fallen on minor employees and vanished interns. He hadn't looked closer. Why would he? He was the CEO. His job was to move forward, not backward. But now he realized Emily had been right in the middle of that implosion. Someone had wanted her gone, permanently, that evening. As the twins sat cross-legged on the floor coloring pictures, Richard crouched beside them. He watched as one drew a figure in a suit standing between two girls, and a shadow with claws stretching out from behind. His stomach clenched. Children had a way of seeing truth adults tried to ignore. Girls, he said carefully, do you remember anyone ever coming to see your mom? Anyone who made her scared? The older twin's crayon stilled. She didn't look up, but her voice was almost a whisper. There was a man. Mommy called him the visitor. She said if he found us, we'd have to run again. Richard's blood went cold. He asked for more details, anything. They described him with chilling clarity, tall, sharp suit, eyes that never smiled. The description matched one of his own former executives. A man Richard had fired years ago for unethical practices, but who had since resurfaced in shadowy corners of the industry. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. Emily hadn't abandoned her future. She had sacrificed it to protect her daughters, to protect them from someone who had wanted her silenced after she stumbled onto truths that could ruin powerful men. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in the dim glow of his office, staring at the files, replaying the girl's words. Every instinct told him this wasn't just about Emily anymore. Whoever had come after her wouldn't stop until everything connected to her was erased, including the twins. The next morning, Richard made his move. He ordered his legal team to prepare not just temporary guardianship, but a petition for full custody. If Emily didn't recover, he doubled his security staff, placing guards on every floor of the hospital where she lay in a coma. And he called in a private investigator, one who specialized in corporate sabotage. But just as he began to feel the walls closing in on the enemy struck first. When he returned to the hospital that afternoon, the air in Emily's room felt wrong. The machine still beeped steadily, but the nurse on duty looked shaken. She confessed that a man in a visitor's badge had tried to enter the room an hour earlier. He hadn't signed in, hadn't left a name. When challenged, he had vanished before security arrived. Richard's fury was volcanic, but beneath it lay something else: fear. The twins weren't safe. Not here, not anywhere, unless he acted. As he left the hospital, his phone buzzed again. Another message, just 6 words this time. You can't protect them forever. Richard stared at the screen, his jaw set like stone. Whoever had written those words didn't understand who they were dealing with. He had built an empire from nothing, had crushed men who thought themselves untouchable. Now, for the first time, he wasn't fighting for wealth or power. He was fighting for something infinitely more fragile and infinitely more important: his daughters. And Richard Carter didn't lose. The city never truly slept. But from the top floor of Richard Carter's glass tower, it almost seemed like it did. Midnight cast the skyline in a silvery hush, but inside his penthouse, the silence was alive, filled with whispers of crayons scratching across paper, the soft giggle of twin voices, and the unspoken truth Richard could no longer deny. These girls weren't strangers. They were his. He saw it in their eyes every time they looked at him, in the way their laughter cracked through the marble walls he had built around himself. But shadows moved in the corners of his empire. The messages had made it clear someone was watching, waiting. And now, after the incident at the hospital, Richard knew time was running out. He sat in his study, walls lined with leather-bound books that he had never once opened. The twins asleep in the adjoining room under the watchful eye of 2 security guards. On the desk before him lay a folder thick with photographs, reports, and names. His investigator had delivered it hours earlier. Richard flipped through each page with the precision of a surgeon dissecting a tumor. The tumor had a name: Daniel Mercer, former executive at his company, fired for corruption, stripped of his titles, but not of his ambition. He had connections in the underworld, men who thrived in the shadows between corporations and crime. And 6 years ago, Mercer had been in charge of the very project Emily had worked on, the project that collapsed under suspicious circumstances. Emily hadn't vanished by chance. She had been erased to protect Mercer's secrets. Richard leaned back in his chair, the city lights glinting in his eyes. All these years, he had thought betrayal was something that happened to other men less careful, less ruthless. Yet betrayal had grown inside his own house, feeding off his empire. And he had been blind to see it. He slammed the folder shut, enough. The next morning, The twins woke to find their penthouse filled with signs of a world they had never known. Sunlight pouring across a table where pancakes steamed. Toys arranged neatly by staff who had worked overnight to create a sanctuary. Richard watched them from the kitchen, awkwardly holding a spatula. He was a man who had never cooked a meal in his life. But when the girls laughed at the sight of him flipping a pancake to high and nearly burning it, something cracked open inside him. For a moment, he forgot the threats, the shadows, the war. He saw only two little girls who deserved childhoods untouched by fear, but the war was waiting. Later that day, his investigator returned with grim news. Mercer hadn't just threatened Emily, he had been siphoning money through the failed project, using her as an unknowing cover. When she discovered irregularities, she had become a liability. He had forced her into silence, and when silence wasn't enough, he had driven her underground, ensuring she could never speak. Her collapse, the infection, the exhaustion hadn't been chance. It was the slow decay of a woman hunted and cornered. Richard's hands curled into fists. He could forgive many things in business, but not this. Not the destruction of innocence. Not the endangerment of children. That night, as the twins slept safely in a room guarded by two of his most trusted men, Richard drove himself to an address provided by his investigator, a private club Mercer frequented, a den for the wealthy who believed their money shielded them from consequence. Richard entered without announcement, his presence turning heads. Mercer was there, lounging in a leather chair, whiskey glass in hand. When he looked up and saw Richard, he smiled. "Carter, didn't expect you dirty your shoes coming here." Richard walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "You thought Emily was disposable. You thought her children were invisible. You thought I would never notice." Mercer's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered. "You built an empire, Richard. Don't burn it down for a woman who isn't worth." The words cut off when Richard's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the glass. For a moment, the entire room froze. Richard leaned forward, his eyes like steel. "They are mine." Silence hung like a blade. Mercer's smirk returned, but thinner now, strained. "Then you've just painted a target on yourself, Carter. Those kids, they're leverage. And leverage always breaks men like you." Richard straightened, every line of his body radiating the truth Mercer had failed to see. "You've never met a man like me." When Richard left the club, his phone buzzed again. Another message. This one wasn't anonymous, it was Mercer's number. "You can't protect them forever, but I can end this anytime I want." Richard stood in the night air, the cities hung beneath him, and felt the weight of the choice pressing in. He could hand the girls over to the system and walk away, safe inside his glass towers. Or he could do what Emily had done, sacrifice everything to protect them. The decision was no decision at all. By the time he returned home, his lawyers were already drafting permanent custody petitions. His security chief was reinforcing every wall of the penthouse. And Richard Carter, the man who once measured life in dollars and deals, had declared a war that no balance sheet could contain. He was no longer a CEO. He was a father, and fathers did not lose. The storm broke on a Thursday morning. The sky above the city was a dull sheet of gray, as if the heavens themselves had been holding their breath. Richard Carter hadn't slept in 2 nights. He had moved through his penthouse like a restless predator, eyes fixed on every detail: the locked doors, the shadows beyond the glass, the faint sounds of the twins sleeping in the next room. Their small lives had become his compass, and every beat of his heart hammered out a promise. Nothing would touch them. Not while he breathed. At the hospital, Emily lay silent. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow, but her face was peaceful, as if she floated somewhere between dreams and shadows. Richard had been at her bedside each day, the twins often curled in his lap in the waiting room, their crayons scratching out drawings of sons, houses, and smiling stick figures holding hands. Every time he looked at those drawings, something inside him broke and something else hardened. That morning, as he stood by her bed, his phone buzzed again. Another message. This one carried no subtlety. "Come alone tonight, or the girls disappear." The address that followed was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the river. His blood turned to ice, but his jaw set with steel. Mercer had made his move. Richard went home, hugged the twins tighter than he ever had, and told them a half-truth, that he had to meet someone to make sure Mommy would be safe. Their small arms locked around his neck, their eyes wide with trust. "You'll come back?" the younger one asked. Richard looked into her eyes, his own eyes reflected back, and nodded. "Always." That night, He walked into the warehouse, the sound of dripping water echoing off rusted beams. Shadows stretched long under the flicker of dying lights. Mercer was waiting, flanked by two men in dark suits. His smirk was razor sharp. "You never could leave well enough alone," Mercer said, lifting a cigarette to his lips. "Emily was supposed to vanish, clean, simple, but you had to dig." Richard didn't flinch. "You poisoned her life, hunted her like prey, and you dared to threaten children." His voice was low, but it carried. "You crossed a line you don't come back from." Mercer laughed, the sound echoing like broken glass. "Children?" He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Those girls were the leverage I needed. I never expected you to claim them. That makes this sweeter. When they're gone, so are you." Richard's fist clenched, but his eyes never left Mercer's. "They're mine," he said, "each were carved from fire, and no one takes what's mine." For a moment, the warehouse was thick with silence, the kind that comes before storms split the sky. Then chaos erupted. Richard had come alone in appearance, but his security team had been stationed outside for hours, waiting. Floodlights blazed through broken windows, armed men swarming in. Mercer's bodyguards drew weapons, but they were outmatched. Within seconds, the warehouse was filled with shouts, scuffles, and the metallic clatter of guns skidding across concrete. Mercer tried to run, but Richard was faster. Years of boardroom calm vanished as he caught Mercer by the collar and slammed him against the rusted wall. "You destroyed her life," Richard hissed. "And you think you can still win?" Mercer's smug mask cracked. For the first time, fear slipped into his eyes. "You can't change what's already done. She's gone." But Richard smiled coldly. "No, she's not," and as if the universe itself had chosen its moment. His phone buzzed again, not with a threat, but with a message from the hospital. "Patient awake, asking for you, for a heartbeat." Richard's grip loosened. Mercer tried to twist away, but security seized him, pinning him in cuffs. Richard barely heard the protests. His heart was already racing ahead, past the chaos, past the vengeance. Back to Emily. He arrived at the hospital minutes later, his lungs burning with more than exertion. When he entered the room, the twins were already there, clutching their mother's hands, tears shining on their cheeks. Emily's eyes were open, weak, unfocused, but alive. Her gaze found him instantly. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, her lips parted, voice raw but certain. "You came." Richard swallowed hard, stepping closer. He wanted to say everything at once: the years he had wasted, the things he should have seen, the promises he had left unsaid. Instead, he simply whispered, "I won't leave again. Not you. Not them." Her hand trembled as it reached for his, the weight of years and secrets pressing into that single touch. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a look that was both apology and confession. "They're yours." The words were barely audible, but they detonated inside him. Everything is confusion, the mirrored eyes. The trust that had pulled him from his ordered world clicked into place. He looked down at the twins, who had stopped crying, their small faces turned toward him. They didn't need the confirmation. They already knew. The weight of empire, wealth, and power had defined him for so long. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Richard Carter wasn't a billionaire CEO. He wasn't a strategist or a conqueror. He was a father. And with that truth, every deal, every skyscraper, every piece of his old life paled beside the two little girls who had called him by accident, yet saved him by design. As dawn broke outside, Emily's hand rested in his, the twins nestled between them. The city could keep its towers, its shadows, its betrayals. Richard had found something greater, something worth every war, every sacrifice. And for the first time in his life, he didn't just feel alive. He felt whole.